Hello, Internet. I am Pastor Recoil, and welcome to my parish. Today is the 5th Sunday after Epiphany, and we're going to talk about it. Welcome to Pastor Recoil's Parish, where I talk about some things in the Bible that you may not have heard about in church, either because it's not quite appropriate for all audiences or it just isn't something that's easy to talk about in a sermon. Today's readings for the 5th Sunday after Epiphany are Isaiah 6, 1-13, Psalm 138, 1 Corinthians 14, 12-20, and Luke 5, 1-11. It's an interesting set of readings that all seem to be about reactions to change. First off, you've got Isaiah 6, when God tells the prophet Isaiah that he's going to say stuff to the people, but they're going to actively not listen to anything he says. And this is pretty much exactly what happens. God, through Isaiah, warns the people that if they don't change how they're acting, their entire way of life is going to get destroyed. Now, this isn't like a God is going to punish you kind of vibe. It's more of that, like, if you touch a hot stove, it's going to burn your hand sort of thing. And of course, a couple generations after Isaiah, when things don't change, the people get conquered by the Babylonian Empire and carted off into exile. Then there's the other side of reacting to change. Psalm 138 is a celebration of the return from that same exile. This time, change is celebrated. Yes, they left their homes again after 70 years in Babylon. That became their home. But this time it was to go back to their home. It's a big change, but this change was one for rejoicing, not one for ignoring. 1 Corinthians 14 continues a section of the Apostle Paul telling the church in Corinth that they need to change, and then laying out some specific ways for them to do it. They listen a bit. I mean, seeing as there is more than one letter to the church in Corinth that we have, and at least one more in addition to that we don't have, I think it's fair to say they didn't all the way listen, but they didn't all the way not listen either. Knowing humans, they listened to the stuff they liked and ignored the stuff they didn't. And then there's the most interesting one, Luke chapter 4, when Jesus tells 4 fishermen that they're not going to fish anymore, and they drop everything and follow Jesus. Their whole lives changed. Now, there's a lot to unpack here, and most of it you can do on your own if you're really interested, but there's 2 things I want to mention before I get to the point of today's video. First off, the fishermen knew Jesus already. A lot of times we think that this story happened out of nowhere. They're just 4 randos that Jesus came across. But Luke's gospel mentions in the last chapter that Jesus healed one of them, Simon's mother-in-law, the chapter before. I mean, Jesus was even staying at his house. So Simon wasn't just impressed with a random teacher, they kind of knew each other. Secondly, there's a little word thing that's interesting. Simon calls Jesus 2 different titles before and after this miracle of fish happens. The first one has kind of a vibe of like teacher or sensei, or like that's the kind of word it is. Someone who knows things. But afterwards, Simon says Lord to Jesus, which kind of is a lot more authority behind that word than there is behind sensei or master or teacher. It shows that Simon thinks of Jesus in a new way after the events of the gospel reading. Apparently, it's one thing for Jesus to heal his mother-in-law, but something else entirely for Jesus to break the rules in something that Simon's an expert at, namely fishing. And I think the overall point of these readings is that change happens, And there's a couple options when you encounter change. You can either be ready for it, or you can get caught up in it. And right now, the American Christian church is getting caught up in a changing world and generally has been reacting badly to the change of our world. It's clinging to an idealized version of the past, or it's digging its heels in and saying, no more. But that doesn't work. These same churches that are refusing to acknowledge that the world is changing often find themselves wondering why they're not getting any new members, why there aren't any kids in church anymore, why the church is getting older. And the answer is usually because the church doesn't matter. I mean, church is boring. Church doesn't speak to today's world. It speaks to a world that is gone. And oftentimes people have terrible experiences with the church, so why go through that again? So what does this mean? The church needs to change along with the world, or it's going to die. Sure, there'll be a part left over, there always is, but those are the options. We either need to change to meet the needs of our changing world, or the world will leave the church behind. It's harsh, but that's what this comes down to. And yet, change always seems to be what God calls God's people into. The real question is the church going to listen? Or is the church going to get left behind? If you want to see more content like this, check out the links to my right, or click the logo just below my face to subscribe so you'll know when my next video comes out. Thank you for watching, and take the time this week to love your neighbor as yourself, especially if you don't like them all that much.